Imagine for a second that you are an ancient physician, right? Thousands of years ago, trying to map out the human body for the very first time.
Oh, which sounds incredibly stressful, by the way.
Right. Total nightmare. But so you open up the chest cavity and you see the heart pumping. And that makes mechanical sense. You see the lungs drawing in air, expanding like bellows. Again, totally logical.
You can physically see the cause and effect.
Exactly. But then you crack open the skull and you find the brain. And it doesn't move. It doesn't pump. I mean, it doesn't really seem to do anything. It just sits there looking like this silent gray gelatinous lump.
Just a completely inert blob of tissue.
Yeah. So where in that lump is your earliest childhood memory? Or where is your ability to understand a joke? Where does a spoken sentence actually originate?
It really was the ultimate black box of early anatomy. Because, you can physically hold a human brain in your hands, but you cannot hold a thought.
Right.
And early science had absolutely no mechanism to bridge that gap between the physical, wet tissue, and the conscious experience.
Well, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're decoding a 2,000-year-old medical mystery that's actually hiding inside three foundational medical roots, psycho, phreno, and phasia.
Right.
These form the structural backbone of how we name disorders of thought and speech today. But I think more importantly, tracing the history of these terms tracks humanity's really chaotic, heavily debated quest to figure out where the mind actually lives inside the body.
What's fascinating here is that the contested part of these words isn't their spelling, it's their clinical meaning.
Yeah.
Language and cognition, like how we generate a thought versus how we physically speak it out loud, are incredibly difficult to cleanly separate.
Oh, absolutely.
And medicine has spent centuries trying to draw a hard anatomical line between the two. The evolution of these specific prefixes and suffixes, it really shows us exactly how our understanding of neurobiology had to radically shift to accommodate that.
Yeah, so we have a pretty clear roadmap for this exploration for you today. First, we are going to dive into the bizarre, literal anatomical origins of these terms, including why the ancient Greeks were absolutely convinced that you do your best thinking with your diaphragm.
Which is still wild to me.
But it's so wild. Then we'll look at the historical failures to physically map the brain. And finally, we will break down the massive, tangible impact these definitions have today on patient care. So, okay, let's unpack this, starting with the oldest roots, because it really highlights just how far off base early human anatomy was. Let's look at phreno.
Okay.
When someone hears phren today, they immediately think of the brain, right? Like in schizophrenia.
Which is a complete historical inversion, actually.
Okay.
If you trace phren back to Homeric Greek, it originally referred to the diaphragm, or the connective tissue around the heart and the lungs.
So the Greeks placed the center of human intellect and emotion right there in the chest, entirely ignoring the skull.
They did, yeah. And if we look at it through the lens of pure physiological observation, rather than, modern neuroscience, it makes perfect intuitive sense.
Wait, how does that make sense?
Well, think about it. When a person is terrified, they don't feel a sensation in their prefrontal cortex, right? Their chest gets tight.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, their breathing becomes shallow and erratic. When they suffer profound grief, their chest physically aches. The Greeks observed that autonomic nervous system response and just concluded logically that the chest cavity must be the seat of consciousness and thought.
Right, because you feel panic in your lungs, not behind your forehead.
Exactly.
There is this amazing anatomical hangover from this era with the word phrenitis. So in classical antiquity, that meant a chest ailment, specifically an inflammation of the diaphragm area. But centuries later, as physicians slowly realized the brain was actually doing the cognitive heavy lifting, the definition of the word drifted to mean brain fever.
Right. It underwent a complete semantic shift. In the modern medical era, the root phreno got reassigned almost entirely to mean the mind. However, that original literal meaning, it stubbornly survives today in one specific vital anatomical structure.
And that's the phrenic nerve.
Right, precisely. The phrenic nerve originates in the neck, passes down between the lung and heart, and drives the mechanical breathing motion of the diaphragm. It has absolutely nothing to do with cognition or memory or psychiatric conditions.
Wow.
So a medical student who just assumes every Phren word is related to the brain is going to completely fail that section of their anatomy exam.
It's a little anatomical fossil hiding in plain sight. Now, contrast that incredibly physical, fleshy origin of Phren with our next root, psycho, from the Greek psyche. This didn't start out as a physical organ at all, did it?
No, not at all. It originally meant breath or life force or soul. Aristotle used it to describe the animating principle of any living thing, so a plant, an animal, a human, not a discrete organ of thought.
It's kind of like, well, if CERN was early humanity trying to point to the physical hardware of the body, the actual meat and muscle doing the work psyche was them trying to describe the invisible software, or like the Wi-Fi signal.
That's a great analogy.
Right, you can't touch it, can't dissect it on a table, but you know instantly when the device is disconnected from it.
That's a highly accurate way to frame it.
Yeah.
And for a really long time, the study of that software stayed purely in the realm of philosophy and religion.
Sure.
But as we move into the 19th century, we see this deliberate, concerted push to turn these abstract concepts into rigorous clinical disciplines. Take the word psychiatry. It was coined in 1808 by the German physician Johann Christian Reil, and it translates literally to medical treatment of the soul.
And he coined that term as a specific act of medical advocacy, didn't he? Because the standard of care for severe mental illness at that time was essentially penal, not medical.
It was purely custodial. People suffering from severe psychiatric conditions were just warehoused in asylums. They're chained to walls, given no therapeutic intervention whatsoever.
It's just horrible.
Awful. By creating the word psychiatry, Reil was attempting a massive paradigm shift. He was arguing that these behavioral manifestations were a medical condition of the psyche grounded in physiology, and therefore these individuals required legitimate clinical treatment, not imprisonment.
So he medicalized the software.
Exactly.
And then a few decades later, Wilhelm Wundt takes it a step further. He opens the first experimental psychology lab in Leipzig in 1879. And his goal was to study that invisible psyche with the exact same empirical rigor that a physicist uses to study thermodynamics.
Wundt wanted to quantify the mind. And once the scientific community reached a consensus that the mind definitely operated out of the brain and not the chest, there was this intense rush to map it out.
Oh, I bet.
Researchers wanted to know exactly where inside that gray lump specific thoughts and behaviors were being generated.
Which perfectly sets up one of the most famous cautionary tales in medical history. Because that initial attempt to physically map the brain went down a spectacularly wrong, albeit highly popular path.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about Franz Joseph Gall and the pseudoscience of phrenology.
Ah, Gall.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Viennese anatomist working right around the turn of the 19th century. And, we actually have to give him credit for his core premise, which was a major leap forward.
Oh.
Yeah, he argued against the prevailing idea that the mind was just one big, undifferentiated cloud of energy. He proposed that different mental functions and personality traits were localized to very specific, distinct regions of the brain.
Which is localization of function. And modern neuroscience completely validates that. The visual cortex handles sight, the auditory cortex handles sound. Gall got the what right, but his how was an absolute disaster.
Total disaster, yeah.
Yeah. He claimed you could read these localized functions by measuring the external bumps and indentations on a person's skull. He mapped out roughly 27 different organs of character, and it included these highly specific, completely arbitrary traits like emotiveness, combativeness, and veneration.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, phrenology became a massive cultural phenomenon.
Queen Victoria had her kids' heads read, didn't she?
She did, but the methodology was systematically dismantled by the French physiologist Pierre Florence, starting in the 1820s.
How did he debunk it?
Well, Florence pioneered ablation studies. He would surgically remove very specific regions of the cortex in animals like pigeons and rabbits, and then observe the resulting behavioral deficits. He demonstrated pretty clearly that removing a section of the cortex didn't magically delete a single trait like combativeness.
Right.
Furthermore, he showed that the external shape of the skull bone had no morphological correspondence to the folds of the brain tissue underneath.
So a bump on your parietal bone doesn't mean you have a highly developed veneration lobe pressing up against it. But I actually have to push back here for a second. When we look at modern neuroimaging, specifically in fMRI, aren't we essentially doing high-tech phrenology?
How do you mean?
Well, we put someone in a scanner, we show them a picture of an angry face, and we look for a brightly colored spot in the amygdala, right? But an fMRI isn't actually measuring a thought. It measures a bold, signal, blood, oxygen level dependent contrast. We are literally just tracking where oxygenated blood rushes in the brain a couple of seconds after a stimulus. We are still just guessing based on biological packaging, aren't we?
That is a very sophisticated critique, actually, and it's one that neuroscientists constantly debate regarding the limits of fMRI spatial resolution. You are totally correct. that a bold signal is an indirect proxy for neural activity. It measures the metabolic demand of the tissue, not the electrical firing of the neurons themselves.
Right, so isn't it the same thing Gall was doing?
Not quite. The crucial difference lies in the statistical and experimental rigor. Phrenology inferred complex abstract traits from inert bone based on purely anecdotal observation,
Ah,
whereas fMRI tracks physiological changes in a living brain across thousands of repeated, highly controlled trials to establish statistical correlation. It's the difference between guessing a factory's output by feeling the bricks on the outside of the building versus measuring the exact electrical grid consumption of specific assembly lines while they're running.
okay, that makes a lot of sense. The methodology is the dividing line. So if skull reading was a biological dead end, how did medical science finally prove localization in humans? That brings us to our final root, phasia, which derives from the Greek phasis for utterance and phenai, to speak.
Right, and the clinical proof for localization didn't come from feeling bumps on healthy skulls. It came from observing the tragic consequences of highly specific brain lesions. The modern clinical understanding of phasia was established by two landmark discoveries in the late 19th century.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The first major breakthrough happens in 1861 with the French surgeon Paul Broca. He had a patient named Louis Victor Leborgne, who went by the nickname Tan. And for over 2 decades, the single-syllable tan was nearly the only vocalization Leborgne could produce.
Right.
But he had completely intact intellect, he comprehended spoken language perfectly, but his speech production was just entirely disabled.
And upon Leborgne's death, Broca performed an autopsy and discovered a severe lesion in the posterior inferior frontal gyrus of the left hemisphere, the region we now call Broca's area.
Right.
This established what we define as expressive or non-fluent aphasia. It was a massive paradigm shift because it provided physical proof that language production and general cognition are anatomically separable.
You can lose the ability to speak without losing the ability to think. And then, just over a decade later, in 1874, the German neurologist Karl Wernicke discovers the clinical mirror image of this condition. Wernicke's patients could speak with perfect fluency. Their grammar and cadence sounded entirely natural, but the content was just a meaningless word salad. A patient might say something like, "I called my mother on the television and did not understand the door before the wallet ran."
The mechanical production of speech was totally intact, but the semantic meaning was absent. Furthermore, Wernicke noted that these patients had severe deficits in comprehension.
They couldn't understand others either.
Right, they couldn't understand what was being said to them, and they often lacked awareness of their own deficit. Wernicke traced this receptive aphasia to lesions in the posterior superior temporal gyrus, also in the left hemisphere, which we now call Wernicke's area.
So Broca isolated the motor production of speech, and Wernicke isolated the semantic comprehension of language. But this sets up a massive theoretical conflict, because for decades, medical textbooks essentially treated the brain like a circuit board with strict isolated modules.
This raises an important question, and it really ignited the localizationist versus holistic debate. In the 1920s, the American psychologist Carl Lashley challenged this strict modular view. Lashley trained rats to navigate complex mazes and then surgically removed varying portions of their cerebral cortex.
Okay.
And he found that the specific location of the lesion didn't matter as much as the total volume of tissue removed.
He called this the law of mass action, right? The memory of the maze wasn't stored in one highly localized maze-running neuron. It was distributed across the cortex. He argued for equipotentiality, that the remaining brain tissue could adapt and take over the functions of the damaged areas.
Yes, and modern aphasiology recognizes that both of these extremes, strict modularity and complete equipotentiality, are oversimplifications. Language processing relies on specialized hubs, certainly, but they operate within vast, distributed, and highly plastic neural networks.
Okay, let's unpack this with a structural analogy. If we think of language processing not as a single isolated factory, but as a complex city traffic grid,
I like that.
Broca's area might be the main suspension bridge out of the city. If a stroke destroys that bridge, traffic, which is the speech, halts completely. But the cars still exist. The intent to travel is still there. Over time, through neuroplasticity, the brain begins rerouting that traffic. It utilizes side streets, secondary pathways in the right hemisphere, or deeper subcortical structures like the basal ganglia to slowly rebuild the ability to get the message out.
That is an excellent mechanistic description of how speech therapy leverages neuroplasticity in stroke recovery. And, understanding that mechanism brings us directly to the real-world stakes of our discussion today, because misunderstanding these terms causes profound, tangible harm in clinical settings.
Absolutely. Let's look at the scale of aphasia. The National Aphasia Association estimates roughly 2 million Americans live with the condition, with about 180,000 new cases occurring every year.
That's a huge number.
It is. And the most frequent cause is a stroke, specifically ischemic strokes affecting the middle cerebral artery, or MCA. The MCA supplies blood to the lateral surface of the frontal and temporal lobes, which happens to be exactly where Broca's and Wernicke's areas sit.
And when a blood clot blocks the MCA, it triggers an ischemic cascade. The oxygen delivery to those language centers halts instantly. Within minutes, the ATP energy pumps in the neurons fail, and the cells stop firing. This results in sudden, profound aphasia.
And because a stroke survivor with aphasia often has no obvious external physical impairment, it leads to a catastrophic misconception. People, including caregivers and employers, frequently assume that broken speech equates to diminished intelligence.
Which completely strips the patient of their dignity. We really must be clinically precise here. Expressive aphasia is a bottleneck in language output. General intelligence, executive function, and memory typically remain completely intact.
Right.
The cognitive engine is running perfectly. The output mechanism is simply jammed.
That same dangerous imprecision in how society understands aphasia plays out in how we use the psycho vocabulary, too. We see these terms conflated constantly. Let's clarify the clinical distinctions rapidly, starting with the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist.
The main distinction lies in their training and scope of practice. Psychiatrists are medical doctors, so they hold an MD, or a DO, which is a doctor of osteopathic medicine.
Got it.
And because of their medical background, psychiatrists focus heavily on the neurochemical and biological basis of mental illness. They are licensed to prescribe medication. Psychologists, conversely, hold doctoral degrees, usually a PhD focused on research or a PsyD focused on clinical practice.
But they aren't medical doctors.
Right. Their expertise lies in psychological testing, behavioral interventions, and psychotherapy, and in most jurisdictions, they do not prescribe medication.
So they tackle the same software from different angles. Now here is a much heavier distinction that the media conflates almost daily: psychotic versus psychopathic.
This conflation is deeply problematic because they describe fundamentally different clinical profiles. Psychosis utilizing the ullosis suffix for an abnormal condition describes a severe disruption in the brain's reality testing networks, often involving overactive dopamine pathways.
So it manifests physically as hallucinations or delusions.
Exactly. Crucially, psychosis is a temporary state or a symptom of a larger disorder, like schizophrenia, and it is highly responsive to antipsychotic medication.
A physical misfiring that disconnects the patient from reality. Now, psychopathy, using the ontp suffix for disease, operates entirely differently.
Completely differently. Psychopathy isn't even an official DSM diagnostic category. Clinically, we refer to severe antisocial personality disorder. It is characterized by structural and functional differences in areas like the amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which process empathy and moral reasoning.
So reality is intact.
Perfectly intact. A person with psychopathic traits exhibits profound manipulativeness and a lack of empathy, but their reality-testing dopamine networks are fine. They do not experience hallucinations. They perceive reality exactly as it is. They simply lack empathetic constraints within it.
Which creates a tragic irony when the media uses the terms interchangeably during crime reporting. If you look at the actual clinical data, people suffering from a psychotic break who are actively disconnected from reality aren't the calculated predators the media portrays. They are overwhelmingly the vulnerable victims of violence.
The empirical data proves that consistently. Precision in medical language isn't just an academic exercise for anatomy students. Using the correct terminology is a primary tool for dismantling stigma, setting accurate treatment expectations, and frankly, preventing harm to highly vulnerable patient populations.
So what does this all mean? If we step back and look at the trajectory we've tracked today, we started with ancient Greek physicians observing the physiological rush of a pounding heart and concluding the mind must live in the diaphragm, giving us the root phreno. We watched 19th century scientists desperately try to measure human character by feeling inert bone or define the invisible soul in a laboratory with psycho. And finally, we saw how the tragic mapping of language disorders, aphasia, forced us to abandon the idea of a simple modular brain, revealing the vastly distributed neuroplastic networks we understand today.
It is remarkable scientific evolution, and we've really only mapped a fraction of the terminology. This knowledge connects to a much wider web of diagnostic roots like neuro for the nervous system or encephalo for the brain itself,
Oh, sure.
or related perceptual deficits like agnosia, which is a failure to process sensory information, or alexia, the inability to comprehend written language. Every term is basically a coordinate on the map of human neurobiology.
But I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to ponder. We look back at Franz Gall and the phrenologists measuring skull bumps to map combativeness, and it seems completely absurd to us now.
Oh, totally absurd.
But considering how radically our understanding of the brain has changed, from the Greeks to Broca to Carl Lashley's mass action to modern fMRI statistical modeling, it makes you wonder, what neuroimaging techniques or diagnostic models that we use with absolute unquestioning confidence today will the medical students of the year 2226 look back on and just laugh at?
That is the beautiful, relentless nature of the scientific method.
Yeah.
The map of the mind is never fully finished. We just refine the coordinates with every generation.
And maybe one day we'll finally understand everything happening inside that silent gray lump. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep challenging the map, and we'll catch you next time.